So good evening to everyone. I'm Thomas Maria Dawson, Interim Executive Director at Center for Political Education. CPE is a resource for political organizations on the left, progressive social movements, the working class, and people of color. We believe social movements are strongest when their organizing and activism are grounded in historical knowledge, strong theory, and rigorous analysis. Tonight's event, the second in our Writing the Third World series, provides you with all three of those things. This special series puts scholars and movement leaders and organizers in conversation about a recent work of scholarship on international struggles for liberation and self-determination. Our next event in this series takes place just a few weeks from now on Wednesday, July 21st, and will feature Johanna Fernandez, author of The Young Lords, A Radical History, in conversation with Nadia Tanu of Palestinian Youth Movement. And you can find the registration link to that event in our chat right now. I am truly honored and extremely excited to welcome Vijay Prashad and Rhonda Ramiro into this space to discuss Vijay's book, Washington Bullets, and its application to the geopolitical conditions of our time. Washington Bullets grips us with bloody accounts of assassination, the machinations of US imperialism bent on choking out people's movements, a veritable manual on regime change described at length in part 2 of the book. But it also breathes life into the heroes of socialist movements and the persistence of their threat to empire. Persistent threats like Evo Morales in Bolivia, who wrote the book's preface, or President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, with whom Vijay just met a few weeks ago. And Vijay, we're looking forward to your report on that sometime soon. Vijay is a longtime friend of CPE. He's both a historian and journalist and the author of 30 books, including Washington Bullets, Red Star Over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. He is chief correspondent for Globetrotter and a columnist for Frontline in India, and he's the chief editor of Leftward Books in New Delhi, and also the director of the Tricontinental, where you can find Vijay's writing and analysis in their newsletter, and we encourage you to check that out on a regular basis. Rhonda is also a longtime friend of CPE and previously helped to lead the center's work. She's currently chairperson with BAYAN-USA, a nationwide multi-sectoral alliance of grassroots people's organizations fighting for national and social liberation of the Philippines. BAYAN-USA serves as an information bureau for the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines and as a center for educating, organizing, and mobilizing anti-imperialist and progressive Filipinos in the United States. Rhonda and Vijay, welcome again, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Rhonda, I will let you get us started.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Thomas. It's great to be here and very excited to start this event. Vijay, are you ready to get started and dive in?
Great to be with you, Rhonda. And well, Bayan, anything else need to be said? I remember well the anti-NATO demonstration in Chicago. And I must say, of all the groups demonstrating against NATO, I don't think anybody was as enthusiastic to get rid of NATO as Bayan. So super to be together with you.
It's great to be here with you too. Yeah, we have a lot to talk about tonight. We could start with NATO, knowing that they just did their summit, but maybe let's kind of back up and let's get into Washington Bullets a little bit more, and then maybe we can talk about NATO after that, because that's actually a topic I'm very interested in discussing with you. So Washington Bullets is one of those gems where you provide this bird's eye view, a long historical view, and then really meticulous details on how US imperialism carries out its pursuit of total hegemony. You published it at a time when we were in the midst of a Trump presidency. So when US aggression and intervention was being conducted with more bombast and less polish. So if you were to add a postscript to the book now that we're 6 months into the Biden presidency, what do you think you would say or add to the book?
I mean, look, it's one of those great delusions of American politics that there is this assumption that there are two parties when it comes to foreign policy, that somehow the Republican Party is more belligerent and the Democratic Party is perhaps a little softer. But in fact, when it comes to foreign policy, there's only one party in the United States. It's the old party of war. It's the party of money. Just take one case after the other. There may be some strategic disagreement, but let's go down the list of cases. Cuba. Biden is not going to change Trump's policy on Cuba. They're going to persist with the suffocation policy. Take the case of Venezuela. No shift from the Trump policy, which actually was no shift, Rhonda, from the Obama policy. Look at Peru right now. Biden sent a former CIA official to be the ambassador. Lisa Kenna is the ambassador in Peru. That election took place a month ago. The machinations of the campaign of Keiko Fujimori, including Vladimir Montesinos, who was an ex-CIA agent sitting in the naval brig just down the street from the presidential palace in Lima, Peru. Phone calls from old Vladimir, so-called Vlad audios that have been released, show him colluding with the Fujimori campaign and saying, go to the US embassy and work things out. This is an ambassador sent by Biden. Biden's language vis-a-vis China, the behavior of Mr. Biden's team in Alaska, Antony Blinken sitting across the way from Councillor Wang, it's a horrendous racist behavior. And then Biden's performance at NATO. I mean, Rhonda, if you watch the swagger, the arrogance of US presidents in these spaces, it's amazing. I mean, in a pandemic, you expect reasonable people to say, okay, listen, people, cease fire on all counts, including hybrid wars. Let's collaborate. Let's we have only one enemy right now, and that's a pandemic. Why not that attitude? No, let's persist with the hybrid war on China. Let's send more warships to threaten China. Let's up the rhetoric. What difference is there? This is the party of war. I know, comes to domestic policy, there are differences. I'm not a fool. But when it comes to foreign policy, what postscript can I write except to say in 3 words, more of the same?
I'd like to see that in writing. That should be the postscript because it's so true. And, really, I was not appalled, not surprised necessarily by Biden's performance at NATO, but it really reaffirmed what we were thinking. NATO came out with this whole NATO 2030 strategy, and it's all about targeting China. And, whose main agenda is that? US and its imperialist allies, its allies. And so it should be no surprise that he really brought it up and sold it. And then the whole pronouncement that came out of NATO afterward was kind of doubling down on that rhetoric. Wanted to, maybe we'll stick with this topic of China for now. So really, over and over throughout your book, you really do provide a lot of examples of how US strategy repeatedly names the defeat of its current rivals or the prevention of the rise of future competitors as its top priority. So I'll just read a couple of short passages from your book. So there was a part where you wrote, the Department of Defense's Defense Planning Guidance in 1990 wrote that its first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere. Our strategy must now refocus on precluding the emergence of any future global competitor. And then, 10 years later, followed by the Project for a New American Centuries, American peace is to be maintained by an expansion. Pax Americana, another way of saying US imperialism, must have a secure foundation on unquestioned US military preeminence. And then, again, Bush's 2002 national security strategy, Hillary Clinton's document on the Pacific pivot. So, really, this is nothing new. But over the past decade, it has become really obvious that the US has set China as its main adversary. So while this US drive for supremacy in Asia Pacific isn't new, and definitely, coming from the Philippine movement, we know that for us, US designs on the Philippines from the 20th century was about dominance in the Asia Pacific, controlling trade routes, and then more recently around containing China. By recently, I mean the past 70 years. So, you know, what aspects of this kind of history repeating itself do you see at play now in terms of the way the US is positioning itself against China, and what might be different? You know, and I think about what's important for, say, anti-imperialists and anti-war activists to keep in mind as we are trying to build this movement for just peace. You know, what should we think about in terms of what has history taught us, but also what could be different about this moment?
I mean, I think you've raised a really important question, and I've thought about this a lot over the past, say, decade at least. It's important to recognize that when you talked about the Philippines, and I know you're knee deep in that struggle, but you'll remember the off and on again, off again, on again relationship with Subic Bay. We're going to, after the Cold War has ended, we're going to remove the base. We're going to leave the Philippines. Oh, wait a minute, we're going to come back. And this relationship of countries, let's call them on the periphery of the Eurasian landmass, Japan, Okinawa Island, Guam, these are all sovereign places, which the United States, including the Philippines, which the United States has literally used as lily pads to project power. Guam is not seen as a place where people actually live. We talk about the indigenous movement in the United States. People talk about indigeneity. There were land acknowledgements. There was in the chat, let's talk about a land trust, land back movement, so on. Let's talk about indigeneity. What about the indigenous people of Okinawa, upon whose land there is just a US base and now extended? What about the US base on the sovereign people of Guam's territory? What about the US bases on the sovereign people of Hawaii's territory? What about the US base on Diego Garcia, where the Chagosian people have been displaced? I mean, there's a lot of self-congratulatory talk about indigeneity within the United States, among the left. But the left doesn't consider that US imperialism essentially displaces indigenous people from the islands of the Pacific in order to project power against Asia. I want that to be central to the identity type conversations that take place in the US. Rhonda, I'm saying this a little strongly, and maybe people will take offense in the way I'm saying it, but I want to also be precise that I'm happy with land acknowledgements. I think they play a very important role in our life. We must always remember the genocide on the continental territorial United States. But then what about this? Where is the land acknowledgement for the Chagosian people who have been tossed out of Diego Garcia, and the United States has nuclear weapons sitting there in the center of the Indian Ocean? So I just want to put all that there, Rhonda, just for our, in a sense, context in this, when we claim the discourse of having a perspective on indigeneity. I want to just put this out there. Now I'm coming to your question. Sorry for that. That was a little explosion. Now coming to your question, there is actually something similar, something different, something similar in all those texts you referred to, and I'm glad you referred to them, because there's a kind of cliched, boring repetitiveness from 1945 guidance all the way down in the State Department. There's a boring repetition. There's a political aspect to it. We won't allow a political rival. So the attack on Venezuela, for instance, is of that kind. We cannot allow the Venezuelan government to lead a regional process, the ALBA, Bolivarian process in South America. I mean, Venezuela is not an economic competitor to the United States. So that was a political attack. Don't allow this political challenge to emerge. And that's why Venezuela is getting it in the neck. Nothing to do with human rights, democracy, all that nonsense. This is directly a political attack. How dare Chavez organize a Bolivarian movement in Latin America, a regional movement, which is against the Monroe Doctrine and so on. But then with China, there's an addition. Because, see, Rhonda, China, in my opinion, is actually a threat to US capitalism. It's actually a threat. And why? It's a threat on two dimensions. Number one, China has developed a science and technology sector which has leapfrogged over Silicon Valley, in robotics, in 5G telecommunications, in green technology, so many aspects. China is more advanced than the United States. And this is what they are very threatened by. That's why they're going after Huawei. You know, that a executive of Huawei, the daughter of the founder, is sitting in a prison in Canada, is a human rights violation. You know, she was trying to fly to Latin America, was changing planes in Canada, and they arrested her. On what grounds? You know, Julian Assange, Mengzi Wu. I mean, these people are all political prisoners, in my opinion, frankly, or economic prisoners. So there is an actual threat on one aspect from the tech and scientific advances. But the second big advance or threat comes from the Belt and Road. Because what the Chinese, it seems to me, have put on the table, if they've told countries of the global south, look, you have a choice now. You can go the IMF route, the IMF road of austerity and structural adjustment policies and all that, or you can come on the Belt and Road Initiative. That's the choice. Belt and Road is not socialism, but Belt and Road is directly a contest, a challenge to the IMF. And that's a direct threat to the US Treasury Department. So the attack on China, Rhonda, is not just a political attack. It's an attack because China is contesting US economic hegemony. It's contesting that directly. And this is something no power has done at this level before. Not even the Soviet Union contested the United States and capitalism at this level. So this is a real threat. And that's why they're responding with this desperation. They can't compete in a free market with China. That's the thing, you see. There's no Adam Smith in the United States anymore. There's merely the atom bomb. This is atom bomb politics. This is not Adam Smith politics.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I think for a lot of the movements, say in the Asia Pacific, there is a strong swelling up of movements against militarism, the use of our countries as lily pads, as the part of that global footprint of military bases of the US, or, you know, even more insidious, I think, are some of those agreements that allow really flexible, so-called flexible arrangements. You can park your US troops there, send 500 or 1,000, but it's not a military base because they're just sitting in a Philippine military base for free without, you know, the legality that they have to deal with if it were an actual US military base. And so, you know, maybe even one of those lessons that we need to draw from are that there have been successful movements against US militarization and all-out war. In your book, you actually point to many, you know, the successful liberation movement of the Vietnamese people to drive out the US, and that the US has been suffering these defeats. And so, you know, there has been some of these changes, but yeah, the US, I couldn't agree with you more that the US is showing its desperation by really doubling down on the military strategy, where it does still have the upper hand. Now, around the Belt and Road, you know, we can probably go back and forth on this at some point, but you know, I know for the Philippines, we would definitely not see it as a choice that we should go for, you know, if we're trying to really go for national industrialization and an independent economy, independent foreign policy. But I see your point around how it is directly challenging the US in the area and is like that counter posing force against US economic and economic dominance in the area. Okay, that was great. Thank you for that exchange and the answer that you had there. Now, I don't want folks to think that this book of yours, if they haven't read it, they should. But if they haven't read it, there's, yes, like Thomas said at the beginning, you know, the gruesome details of the anatomy of US coups and the violence around it and everything. It doesn't hold back from that. But you also talk about the hope that, you know, really these movements persist. And even in just the last year, even under COVID, we've seen some of these courageous movements continue to grow. We've seen people take to the streets to protest austerity measures, which have gotten worse over the past several months. We've seen worker struggles take place. We've seen even the continuing of armed resistance, against totalitarian regimes or national liberation movements continue. So, there's all these various forms of resistance that hasn't stopped. And like you said, in Washington Bullets, the very fact that the bullets keep coming is because the people keep coming too, and they aren't stopping. So as this crisis continues and maybe gets worse, we're going to see more unrest, some spontaneous, some organized. What do you think are the prospects for really moving forward to a more revolutionary movement? And what do you think needs to be done, let's say in the US, to move us in that direction of revolutionary change?
So I'm just going to just drop a bunch of thoughts, observations, right? Because I don't want to pretend that these are systematic things. The first thing I want to say is that today the institute I direct, Tricontinental, released a report on US military bases and French military bases in Africa. It's a really good report, and we did it in collaboration with the Research Institute in Ghana. I highly recommend it. You can go to our website and have a look. The design is beautiful, but the report is important. And why I'm starting there is because, look, Africa Command, the US Africa Command, is based in Stuttgart, Germany. And that's because not a single African country will allow the United States to base their command structure on the continent. That's amazing. The African Union in 2016, at one of their peace and security meetings, condemned foreign military bases in Africa. Now, they haven't been able to stop them. There are a lot. I visited the base in Agadez in Niger. It's it's the world's largest drone base. I don't know if people know that the United States has an enormous drone base just at the lip of the Sahara Desert in the Sahel region. There are all these at the state level. There are these resistances that exist. At the same time, as you said, the people stood up. I mean, they did a coup in Bolivia. The people fought back and they threw out the coup government at great personal risk. At great risk, the movement for socialism just won the election, came back. In Peru right now, it's at a standstill. Pedro Castillo, who won the election last month, they're not allowing him. Yet Peru Libre and all other allies are on the streets. They're not letting go. They're not letting go. There are tens of thousands of farmers sitting outside New Delhi. 250 million workers went on strike on the 26th of November last year. I mean, the world is on the move. I mean, I just don't want people to think that the wretchedness of US imperialism is going to be taken lying down by people. They are on the move. The tragedy, Rhonda, if I'm going to put it plainly, because you asked about the United States, the tragedy is that there is a great deal of confusion in the left and liberal circles in the United States about imperialism. There is a great deal of confusion. There is an enormous faith in the US government. Even left liberal people at the end of the day have faith in the US government. And how do we know this? We know this because at times they call for the US to intervene in other conflicts. They'll come out openly and say, yes, the US should bomb Libya, or the US should bomb Syria, or the bomb here, bomb there. Have you lost your minds? Do you not know what it means for these countries to be bombed by the United States from the air? I mean, before the bombing of Libya, I went on Democracy Now!, venerable institution of the liberal left. And I had to debate Juan Cole, a professor from the University of Michigan, who was in favor of the intervention. And I also felt that the people at Democracy Now! Seemed to be in favor of the intervention. I felt very alone saying, this is insanity, guys. And look what they did to Libya. Libya, where I first visited in 1974, I wrote a book about that war called Arab Spring, Libyan Winter. It broke my heart to see how people in the United States so cavalierly were saying, let's go get rid of Gaddafi. What's it to you, your business to bomb countries? And then let's go bomb Syria. What is this, like a picnic? You're going to send your planes in a picnic? Let's go do this. Let's overthrow the government in the Philippines. Why not? I mean, I may not like Mr. Duterte. I may not like him at all. But what's it to me? It's the people of the Philippines who have to settle accounts with Mr. Duterte. You don't want the United States to go bombing here and there to solve problems. People need to stand up and fight their own battles, frankly. We give solidarity, yes, to struggles. But look, don't ask for intervention like this. It's ridiculous. So, as long as there is this confusion in the US left and in liberal circles about the goodness, the well meaningness of the Bidens and the Pelosi's and so on, as long as this fantasy exists, the US left is of no use for the world. It's of no consequence. There are sections of the US left that don't believe they should defend the Venezuelan people's right to sovereignty. They believe that Nicolas Maduro should be overthrown and so on. As long as these people don't wake up and understand their complete arrogance regarding the world, what use is the US left, Rhonda? I don't get it. You can't settle accounts with your own ruling class and you're out there lecturing everybody. So, when one asks, what can the US left do? Take a hold of your own house, friends. Take a hold of your own house. Stop lecturing other people. You live in the most wretched country where the government let the people down during COVID so badly. A country where there is such poverty, there is such indifference from the elite, contempt for the poor. Settle accounts with this ruling class, which is, wants to spend more money destroying other countries. This is a ruling class which has contempt for the world and its own people. And yet you have faith in this ruling class that hobnobs with Jeffrey Epstein and so on. I mean, this is the character of the ruling class, fellas. Settle accounts with this ruling class. Don't go saying, let's, start up the bombers and go and bomb here, there. You don't like a country, coup the government. Like Elon Musk said, coup the government. I mean, what behavior is that? And that, Rhonda, I'm just saying, the gap between Elon Musk's offensive tweet, which came around the Bolivia time, he said, we'll coup any country we want. That attitude I hear from sections of the US left liberals. Sections of them will line up behind the White House and say, our Democrat is looking presidential now. What a disgraceful attitude. What a disgraceful attitude.
Mhm. And I think one of the things in your book that you really highlight is how there's been a complete co-optation of the language and the use of culture, the use of culture and language and the academe to try and justify these interventions under humanitarian grounds. I mean, I look at the way humanitarian aid, so-called humanitarian aid, right? It's all militarized. It's brought in by the US military under the rationale that they're the only ones that have the apparatus to be able to distribute this aid. And why is that? There's no questioning about why it is that the US military or its allied partners, say in NATO or in the UN, are the only ones that have the ability to administer aid to the world. It's just, it's really blows my mind sometimes. Okay, so in thinking about what could push the movements in the US, so I agree with you, the need for demonstrating genuine solidarity, and a lot of that means respect for the self-determination of peoples. And not once have I seen where we should be calling for US intervention. That will never, bring about a positive change in a situation there. So, what should the U.S. left be thinking about here, as far as trying to, push the class struggle in this country, push the movement of the working people, to resolve the contradictions with the elite in this country? Where do you see some of the maybe the bright spots which could be emerging now?
There are lots of campaigns ongoing. And I'll just name one because I think it makes sense. Although it's not a mass struggle, it's just on the table. It's called Move the Money. I just feel like it's so intuitive for a working class struggle in the United States to say, look, don't spend the money on military bases and on such an enormous military. Spend the money feeding people, training people, building basic infrastructure. That kind of attitude that was there in Martin Luther King's last set of speeches. from, the speech he gave in the Riverside Church, which is, he said it was called A Time to Break the Silence, all the way to the last speech. He said there's, what is it, the three evils of militarism, racism, and what was the third? Militarism and capitalism. Those were the three evils, and he said, got to deal with the military, racism, and capitalism. Got to settle accounts with these. So, I mean, I think in that sense, there's got to be we've got to chart that way forward. There's an intuitiveness to this politics, I mean, I think, okay, trade unions are very weak in the US, but trade unions have for a long time basically associated themselves with the camp of imperialism. Most trade unions, at least their bureaucracies. I write in the book about the role of US trade unions in the coup in Guyana. And one British intelligence official said, don't call it the AFL-CIO. He said, we call it the AFL-CIA, because the CIA has infiltrated some of these arms of, the free trade union movement and so on, was put to the service of US foreign policy objectives. So, I mean, I think still there is well worth the struggle for poor people's movements, for movements that are against racism, the various formations that are against police brutality, to call for a shift in priorities. I'll put it like this to you, Rhonda, and this is a clear-cut way. We have a lot of campaigns, but we need to think about a country's values differently, and campaigns need to be built on some of these things. You don't judge a country based on its constitution. You judge a country based on the way it does its budgeting. The constitution may be all great and everybody's equal and so on, but just look at your budget. You spend so much money on war and so little money on building the capacity of people. That's shameful. Campaigns are built around values, and this country, the United States of America, fails its people. Its elite fails the people. That's where the hope lies, building those movements. So I mean, I keep seeing it goes in cycles. As there is a spectacular attack, particularly on an African American, some spectacular attack, whether it's Michael Garner or it's Eric Garner, or it's George Floyd and so on. These spectacular attacks take place. A cycle of protest starts. This is the moment when trade unions need to go onto the streets and join the protests, and other mass struggles need to join. That fusing of the dynamic of popular struggles around an issue just doesn't seem to hold in the United States. We see this in other countries. There'll be a cycle will begin of protests. We saw this in Argentina around the question of abortion rights, massive demonstrations. Why? It starts around abortion rights, but then the trade unions come, the campesino organizations come, and they create a fused block of the people against the oligarchy. That doesn't seem to happen in the United States because liberal NGO culture has parceled people's movements out. You work on race, you work on gender, you work on this and so on. And that fusing of the popular bloc just doesn't seem to occur. People are like, oh yeah, it's a struggle about racism, but a lot of talk about intersectionality, and that's fine. That's on the interpretive side. But we don't talk enough about the fusing of the historical bloc. The need to create that moment when the next time people are on the street, other movements need to join them, not in solidarity. That's the thing. You see, if I'm in a trade union and there is an attack, there's a brutal killing of a human being, I don't go out in solidarity with the African American community. I go out there to change the damn system. That's why I'm there. I'm not there in a noblesse oblige to you. Killing of a human being is an affront to me. It's an affront to me. It's not me giving you solidarity. I genuinely don't like the term ally, because every pain is my pain. Every pain is my pain. I'm not there for your pain. I'm there because I feel pain that you are being assaulted. You understand? It's not that I'm coming in a noblesse oblige fashion. This attitude has to change. And I can tell you, in Argentina, watching from the ground, the building of that historical bloc, which then was made it possible to defeat Mauricio Macri in the election. That's how history proceeds. And I think we haven't in the United States seen the congealing of the historical bloc, the popular historical bloc, in a long time. It just hasn't happened. It's this piecemeal movement culture that has developed. Even in Occupy, you didn't see the historical bloc congeal for a series of reasons. So I think, when you ask what's the scene, one is you got to lose faith in this government, and you got to lose faith in this, liberal bullshit elite. And the second thing is we've got to change our attitude towards solidarity.
Yeah, and really see it as shared struggle, shared enemy, shared struggle, shared pain, right? And then hopefully that shared victory at the end. Okay, so this is the moment during our time today where I need to remind folks that you can also ask questions. So I encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A box on your Zoom function, and we'll be pulling some questions from there to ask. So I see that there is a few questions coming in here, and so I'm just gonna pick a couple, and let's see where we can go with this, Vijay. So the first one comes from Pete, a good friend of the center. How does the more of the same paradigm apply to Afghanistan? So, definitely right now, this is a timely question as we see the so-called US withdrawal, right? So what can we expect or even fight for in the struggle?
Yeah, so I did two reports on this for the Globetrotter system. The first one was with Noam Chomsky, and the second I did on my own. The one with Noam, we looked at how the US footprint is actually pretty misleading. Like, there will remain a large number of mercenary and other kinds of contractors in Afghanistan. The formal US troops will pull out and actually have withdrawn from Bagram base. There was an amazing photograph circulated on the internet of all these white trucks sitting there lonely. It's a little bit like Vietnam, 1975. They forgot to put the lights off in the embassy, when they left on the helicopters. And here all the trucks were left behind. I mean, I don't know what kind of money is just left behind on these bases, the equipment. They don't bother to remove them. So yes, one question is, it's not a total withdrawal because these contractors will remain. The second thing is, I interviewed, I know that I do a lot of this talking to intelligence agents, but I interviewed somebody in Pakistani intelligence because I thought they would tell us something interesting about the question of Afghanistan. And his view was quite interesting. I mean, he said that, look, basically everybody is resolved to the fact that Taliban is going to come to power in Kabul eventually. And for the United States, he said this is actually not a bad thing, because the Taliban will actually disrupt Chinese plans for the Belt and Road. Plus, the East Turkmenistan group, which has been operating in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, is already based in Afghanistan. And he said, well, they are very close to the Taliban. And so he was like, look, if the Taliban are back in Kabul, the next 9/11 is not happening in New York City. It's going to happen in Beijing, or it might happen somewhere there, because this group they are like the old Uzbek, jihadi groups that I well remember, met some of them in Waziristan. Those guys were totally, totally committed. I've seen some of these, the East Turkmenistan group in Syria, these are hardened fighters. This is the old Al-Qaeda, and they haven't gone anywhere. That's the other thing, is that the US is saying, oh, we defeated Al-Qaeda, and so now we can bring the Taliban back. It's cool. But this is the old Al-Qaeda. They're just in slightly different garb. Their anger is turned towards China now. And so this is a game the United States has played before. You will remember when the US first began to play in Afghanistan, it was the Brzezinski game. And Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, said that, look, let's fund the worst jihadis in Afghanistan in order to pull the Soviets in, and then make Afghanistan the Soviet Vietnam. That was Brzezinski's direct quote. I'm not making it up. Now the game, I think, and I'm saying this because this is what intelligence people in that region are saying, the game is, yeah, okay, let's allow the Taliban back in power, or some sharing with Ashraf Ghani, who basically is the mayor of Kabul. He's not the president of Afghanistan. There'll be something, but we're going to strengthen the East Turkmenistan group and let them go and try to break up China. Let them go and do some terrorist attacks and so on, because that's what they are being egged on to do. So, this is a very dirty game. I understand people have very strong feelings knowing nothing about Xinjiang, about, forced labor, this, that, and the other. There's all kinds of nonsense going around. A lot of that information coming to you from Adrian Zenj, who's an anti-Semitic Christian fundamentalist who basically works for the CIA, the Jamestown Institute. He's the guy who was scandalously on Democracy Now. A guy who works for Jamestown was on Democracy Now for an hour talking about Xinjiang. I mean, come on, guys, what is that? So, there is an ugliness happening in the heart of Asia, and we should be aware of that. Now, this ugliness happening in the heart of Asia should not be confused with, oh, great, the US is withdrawing. I get it. I'm happy the US is withdrawing. But let's also have the cold steel of reality poke us in the face a little bit. This is not a withdrawal that is leaving behind, Vietnam 1975. This is a very ugly game that the United States government is playing.
Yeah, and I can just imagine now what kind of intelligence apparatus are they going to leave there? Who's going to be working and who's going to be the eyes and the spies for the US now? And who are the contractors that are going to remain? Who from NATO will still be there? It's not, like you said, it's not a withdrawal like the defeat of the US in Vietnam in 1975. We have time maybe for 2 more questions, and there's a couple more that are really interesting. So I'll get to the next one. Okay, and this one takes us back to the United States. So do you think a vanguard type workers movement is possible or venerable in the US? How do we reckon with the often pro-military sentiments among huge swaths of the American working class? And where did you get your t-shirt? And I'm pretty sure that part of the question was directed at you, Vijay, and not me.
Well, this is a very old T-shirt, and it's an old Soviet design. So I don't, I've had it for a long time, and I love it, and you can't have it. So that's the thing, and I don't know where you can get it. I hope you can find it. And good catch, good eye to catch it. The word venerable in that question was amazing because we were talking about the story I told you earlier from Saigon in 1969, the name before Ho Chi Minh City, about Venerable, the Temple of the Venerable. I'm not going to say any more, Rhonda, because you'll have to get the selected Ho Chi Minh book from Leftward, which will tell the story about the Temple of the Venerable from September 6th, 1969. Anyway, I don't know, I'm not attempting to build the people's movement in the United States. So I don't know. I don't want to take a stab at the question. I just feel like there's a lot of popular movements, and there's got to be a way for the popular movements to have a conversation about the historical block that needs to be created. Whether it's vanguardist or not vanguardist, I just don't know. I mean, I would take my lead from people who are organizing. I just can't answer that question. From what perspective will I say anything? I'm not knocking on doors. I'm not trying to build movements. That much limitation I recognize, Rhonda. I just don't know. I mean, you need to be having these conversations with each other. You need to be having and I feel this idea that the workers are saturated with militarist feeling. That may be true. But these things are not permanent. These things are not permanent conditions. If you tend carefully to your Gramsci, you will see that in Gramsci, in his assessment of working class consciousness, talks about the contradictions in consciousness. Yes, there might be, salute the flag, thanks for your service, that kind of thing. A lot of people in family, but also mistreatment of veterans is a theme. That's a consistent reality. Unemployment is a reality. Being considered with contempt by the elite is a reality. Movements should be built from there, not from a defensiveness. Defensiveness, I mean by saying, oh my God, the working class is this. It's a wrong attitude. Don't mimic the contempt that the elite has for the working class by reproducing that contempt of one's own, saying, the working class is militaristic. Therefore, that's wrong. That's showing contempt to the working class. One has to have compassion with our classes. Our classes must be seen for their contradictions. We have to build from there. But I don't know how.
Yeah, and I would just say that one thing around that is, speaking from someone organizing in the Filipino community, sure, there are a lot of conservative sentiments among some people. But once you do start talking about the issues of why they came here, what drove them to migrate, the utter poverty, right, that they face back home, the conditions they face again here, it doesn't take much to get through that initial, what we might see as conservatism, or even pro-military, or pro, totalitarian, like Duterte's whole thing around cracking down on crime, and launching this war on drugs. Once you, kind of start talking to people about the issues, why do they experience the crime? Why do they feel fearful? Why are they so poor? They their consciousness is piqued very quickly. And so, like DJ said, we can't show contempt for our people. We have to show understanding and compassion, and meet them where they're at, and talk to them and organize with them jointly in struggle against the issues that are impacting them on a day-to-day. And then we make those connections to the bigger picture. I really do think that the possibilities are there. They have to be. We can't allow the imperialists to win. And as long as people are willing to continue to do that work of organizing, we'll win. I think Thomas and Hasmin have said we have about time for one last question. So why don't we go to that? So this one comes in, speaking not of the US, state level resistances are important, but movements cannot count on this. People are talking in Latin America of occupying the state. Francia Marquez, is this a hopeful approach to you, to occupy the state in the sense of challenging the imperialist, colonialist, patriarchal states without allowing for the same people or oligarchs to come back into power? So I think that's, I think the last question that we have time for. Any thoughts on that, Vijay?
I mean, this is the biggest question that confounds the 21st century left, because I think, look, firstly, we struggle because we want to take power, frankly. I mean, Rhonda, we don't struggle just to struggle. We are not permanent strugglers. I want to take power. I want the people to come to power. We want to win. We're not just struggling. We have to have the ambition to win. And if you have to have the ambition to win, you are going to inherit the state immediately. That was the experience, let's say, in Cuba. You have to inherit the state immediately. Then it's a protracted process of dismantling the state. It takes a long time. You started the process of dismantling the state in a way. Look at Venezuela. You start the comunas, dual power, all this stuff, and then you come under immense imperialist attack. What are you supposed to do? Just say we'll dismantle the state and then leave ourselves powerless to imperialist attack? You can't do that. You just can't do that. I mean, one has to have some sense of practicality, what we're up against. We have to have the ambition to win. We're fighting to win, but we have to have a sense of who our enemies are. They are not going to say, oh, you won an election. Oh, great. Now we'll let you dismantle the state and, build some socialist paradise. They're going to attack you. And so you have to defend yourself. What tools do you have to defend yourself? What the Cubans taught us all is you have to basically arm the people, not necessarily with pistols and whatever, but you arm them with the hardness of theory. They have to have an understanding of imperialism. They have to have mass education projects. All of that takes time. In the immediate term, the Bay of Pigs, you're going to have to fight them. You'll have to build with the state institutions. So we can't have a utopian understanding of the building of socialism. We got to have a realistic understanding, a materialist understanding. So I'm all for occupying the state and so on, but I'm also for taking power. I thought that book I read years ago when Thomas Mariadsen was a student, the book came out 2 decades ago, Thomas, the book came out. It was called How to Change the World Without Taking Power. I thought, seriously, you have to take power. Holloway was writing about the Zapatistas. They never took power, and I don't think they changed the world, frankly. So, how to change the world without taking power? You can't do it. You have to take power. People in building movements in the United States have to be ambitious. You got to fight to win. You're building a movement in San Francisco, take over the mayor's office. Let's see what you can do if you have a left-wing mayor. What can you do? Can you just suddenly open all the books, all the contracts open? Let sunlight come in. Let's put them all online. You have to bid online and so on. You can do amazing things challenging the system. You'll be gone in one term because they'll come after you. You got to go and risk being in power. You can't be permanent activists. I don't want to be an activist all my life, Rhonda. I seek to win. We want to overthrow capitalism and build socialism. I don't believe with, people say, well, look, it's just great to struggle. Sorry. No, tell that to people who are starving to death. Tell that to 700 million people in India who can't eat. They are not there just to have the aesthetics of struggle. They want to win. They want to win.